The twilight sun bathed the California coast in a dreamy hue of orange and gold, stretching all the way to the horizon. Gentle waves lapped at the sandy shore, leaving behind a foamy white line like a natural brushstroke. The sea breeze wafted softly, carrying its signature salty scent, creating a scene of serene tranquility. Yet, somewhere in the stillness, a quiet sadness lingered, like a faint echo from the depths of the ocean. The sea had always been a silent companion for Eleanor. It held her memories, her joys, and her unfulfilled dreams. But this evening, the sound of the waves failed to soothe her. Instead, it seemed like a reminder, an echo of the past, stirring a piercing loneliness within her. The two-story wooden house nestled modestly among towering pine trees appeared like a painting, visible through the large library window. Sunlight streamed through the branches, casting warm golden streaks across the wooden floor and towering bookshelves. The space exuded a blend of antiquity and quiet elegance, but like Eleanor, the house now sat in cold silence. This wooden house was once a symbol of happiness, the starting point of a perfect family dream that Eleanor and Richard built together. But now, it felt too spacious, reflecting the emptiness inside the woman who had once called it home. Eleanor stood before the bookshelf, her brown streaked with silver hair neatly tied in a bun, tidy but unassuming. Her beige sweater embraced her slender frame, highlighting the delicate features of her face. But her eyes, once brimming with life, now carried a sadness she could not hide. Her slender fingers glided over the spines of books, tracing the ridges as if feeling the textures of her own life. Richard, her brilliant husband with hands capable of turning any idea into reality. But his passion had swept him far from Eleanor's world. The drawings, the ambitious projects, they made him forget a simple truth: beside him was a woman yearning for love, for the companionship he had once promised to devote entirely to her. Eleanor turned and walked to the large window overlooking the sea. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the sun slowly descended, leaving behind a crimson glow at the end of the day. Inside her, emotion swelled like an undertow, silently rising and pushing her closer to a truth she wasn't yet ready to face. This evening, the waves continued to caress the shore as gently as they had over the years. But within Eleanor, another wave was rising, a wave of loneliness, longing, and something unnamed. Something her heart had been quietly searching for all along. The distant hum of a car engine broke the evening stillness. Tires crunched over the gravel path leading to the wooden house, creating a steady rhythm, signaling the return of someone after a long journey. A dark green Jeep Wrangler, dusted from miles on the road, pulled up at the gate. The fading sunlight cast a gentle golden glow over everything. Caleb stepped out of the vehicle, pulling along an old leather suitcase. At 22, with tousled blonde hair and the rugged charm of youth, he exuded energy in a simple white t-shirt and faded jeans. A large, heavy travel backpack hung from his shoulder, though it didn't weigh him down as much as the nervous anticipation behind his ever-present, radiant smile. Caleb had returned after 4 years of college away from home. He carried with him the fervor of youth, memories of vibrant times, but couldn't quite hide the tinge of uncertainty about the future that lay ahead. The front door opened. Richard, Caleb's father, appeared. Dressed in a crisp, white, ironed shirt tucked neatly into dark slacks, his polished appearance as a successful architect couldn't mask the distant look in his eyes as he regarded his son. Richard approached, a practiced, polite smile on his lips, a habit rather than an expression of warmth. They shook hands, a handshake that was brief, stiff, and devoid of affection. That handshake, dry and mechanical like lines on a blueprint, symbolized the invisible chasm between them. They were father and son, yet also two strangers compelled to connect. Eleanor emerged from inside, dressed in a modest floral dress. Her steps were light but unhurried, bringing a warmth that seemed to cut through the stiffness in the air. "Welcome home, Caleb," she said, her voice soft yet resonant enough to overpower the surrounding silence. Caleb turned to look at Eleanor, a bright smile breaking across his face. But his gaze lingered for a moment. There was something in the way he looked at her, a fleeting confusion, an emotion he couldn't name. "Thank you, Aunt Eleanor," he replied, his tone sincere but unable to conceal a faint awkwardness. That look, though fleeting, spoke of something deeper. A mixture of familiarity and distance, of gratitude and something more forbidden. Dinner unfolded in a somewhat strained atmosphere. The dining table was impeccably set, and the warm glow of the yellow lights softened the tension among the three. Richard sat at the head of the table, with Caleb across from him. Eleanor sat in between, serving as an unspoken bridge. The faint clink of cutlery against plates filled the silences between fragmented conversations. Richard talked about work, skyscrapers, and ambitious projects. Caleb shared tales of university life, challenging courses, and a few interesting friends. Eleanor said little. She listened, occasionally smiling, sometimes asking questions to ease the awkwardness. But her gaze occasionally rested on Caleb, a gentle, yet deeply concerned look, as though she was searching for something in the young man before her. The stories exchanged were like scattered pieces, an attempt to fill the void, but they couldn't mask the underlying distance. Three individuals, sitting at the same table, each carrying their own thoughts and emotions. The golden light shimmered over the three faces, a father seemingly detached from his own family, a stepmother exuding gentleness but harboring complex emotions, and a young man just returning home, yet carrying a world of unfamiliarity with him. The wooden house enclosed them, but the silence within its walls hinted at the unspoken truths lying beneath. The dining room was now empty, save for the half-cleared plates and cups neatly arranged on the kitchen counter. The yellow light from the ceiling cast long shadows on the wooden floor, creating a cozy yet quiet atmosphere. The steady sound of water running from the kitchen faucet blended with the faint rustle of papers from Richard's study, distant and indistinct. The spacious living room, furnished with an elegant cream-colored sofa set and a wooden coffee table, exuded a muted sophistication. A small table lamp illuminated the corner of the room, softening its emptiness but accentuating the stillness. Eleanor entered, her bare feet gliding silently over the cool wooden floor. Her face carried a hint of boredom, her eyes dreamy, as though lost in faraway thoughts. She picked up the TV remote from the coffee table and turned it on. The TV flickered to life with a series of crackling sounds as channels flipped past. Eleanor paused on a romantic movie. On the screen, the main characters gazed into each other's eyes, their tender gestures, passionate kiss, and subtle expressions radiated an intimacy so profound it was impossible to look away. Eleanor froze. She intended to change the channel, but an unfamiliar sensation rooted her in place. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen, drawn into the movie's emotional current. It had been far too long since Eleanor felt anything like this. The intense emotions that once made her heart flutter were now faint memories. Yet this moment, this movie, unearthed something deep within her, a part she thought had been lost forever. The soft sound of footsteps behind her pulled Eleanor back to reality. Caleb walked into the living room, a glass of water in hand. He stopped at the doorway, his eyes briefly flicking to the TV screen. A mischievous smile spread across his face, carrying the playful energy of youth. "Looks like the TV's pretty interesting tonight, Aunt Eleanor," Caleb said, his tone light but tinged with teasing. Eleanor jolted. Her face instantly flushed, as though caught doing something forbidden. She hurriedly turned off the TV, the remote trembling slightly in her hand. "No. Nothing at all," she stammered, avoiding Caleb's gaze. "I was just flipping through. Do you need something?" Caleb shrugged and stepped closer, setting his glass of water on the coffee table. His expression remained playful, though there was a trace of an inexplicable curiosity in his eyes. "I was just thirsty," he replied casually, as if oblivious to Eleanor's embarrassment. "Go ahead and keep watching. I won't bother you." He turned to leave, but just before exiting the room, Caleb glanced back at Eleanor, the smile lingering on his lips. Eleanor stood frozen in the living room, the remote still clutched tightly in her hand. The sound of Caleb's footsteps faded, but her heart raced more wildly than ever. She stared at the now blank TV screen, as if trying to make sense of what had just transpired. That moment was more than embarrassment. It was a stirring, a dangerous yet thrilling sensation, like a door cracking open to a place Eleanor had never dared to step into. The beach stretched wide, its fine white sand shimmering under the gentle light of dawn. The sun had just risen above the horizon, painting the drifting clouds with soft hues of pink. Gentle waves lapped at the shore, their rhythmic sound like a soothing, wordless melody. Overhead, the cries of seagulls blended with the light sea breeze, carrying the unmistakable salty tang of the ocean. Eleanor walked slowly along the shoreline, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand. A light blue linen dress clung gently to her slender frame, fluttering softly in the breeze. Her chestnut hair gleamed in the sunlight, swaying with each gust of wind. Her face was calm, her gaze distant as it stretched over the vast ocean, as though the waves had carried away all her worries. On weekends, the sea was Eleanor's sanctuary, the place where she sought peace. Here, the waves comforted her, and the salty air seemed to restore a balance within her soul. In the distance, Eleanor spotted Caleb. He was sitting alone on a large rock jutting out toward the sea, his lean figure striking against the vast backdrop. His back was turned to her, his eyes seemingly fixed on the distant waves, as if listening to secrets only the ocean could tell. This morning walk was no longer solitary. Eleanor saw Caleb, Richard's son from his previous marriage, seated at a familiar spot she once cherished. A flicker of hesitation crossed her mind, but she decided to approach. Eleanor moved closer, her steps light, as though afraid to disrupt the tranquil moment. "Good morning, Caleb," she greeted, her warm voice blending seamlessly with the breeze. Startled, Caleb turned around. A radiant smile broke across his face, dispelling the pensive air that had surrounded him moments earlier. "Good morning, Aunt Eleanor," Caleb replied, his tone bright and cheerful. "Do you enjoy coming out here in the mornings too?" Eleanor nodded gently and sat down on the rock beside him. Together, they gazed out at the ocean, where the sunlight of dawn spread across the water like liquid gold. At first, their conversation was casual. They talked about the waves' endless rhythm, the drifting clouds in the sky, and the sharp cries of the seagulls swooping overhead. Their words were simple and light, yet they brought an ease that felt natural and comforting. Caleb tilted his head, listening intently to Eleanor's words. There was no judgment in his gaze, no sense of distance. Eleanor felt the sincerity in his eyes, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Their idle chatter gradually turned deeper. They shared childhood memories, unfulfilled dreams, and even the pain they had long kept hidden. Between them, a natural and unforced connection was forming, a harmony of souls quietly taking shape. The soft morning light fell gently on their faces as they looked into each other's eyes. In that moment, no words were needed. Both understood that something had shifted between them. Amid the sound of waves and the golden morning sun, the barriers of age and family roles seemed to dissolve. All that remained were two souls finding understanding and solace in the serenity of the sea. Sunlight filtered through the small garage window, casting patterns of light and shadow on the dusty concrete floor. A deep red 1965 Ford Mustang sat silently, its dusty surface exuding both nostalgia and melancholy, a relic of time past. The thin layer of grime covering it only added to its vintage charm, a symbol of memories long forgotten. Eleanor pushed open the creaky garage door and stepped inside. The space was filled with old belongings, spare tires, faded toolboxes, and an ancient wall clock that had stopped ticking years ago. She moved closer to the car, her eyes betraying a flicker of concern as they fell on a small puddle of oil beneath the chassis. This Mustang was her father's treasured possession, a gift steeped in family meaning. But it had sat untouched for too long, and the oil puddle hinted at trouble, leaving her uncertain if the car could ever be revived. The sound of footsteps behind her broke Eleanor's train of thought. Caleb appeared, a few tools in hand. His eyes lit up when he saw the Mustang, and a bright smile spread across his face. "What's going on, Aunt Eleanor?" he asked, his tone curious. Eleanor pointed at the oil puddle with a faint sigh. "This car belonged to my father. It's been sitting here for years, and now I'm afraid it might be beyond saving." Caleb crouched to examine the oil leak, his eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. "Let me take a look. I love classic cars. Do you want to fix it up?" Eleanor was taken aback by Caleb's eagerness. She hadn't known about his passion for cars. Watching his enthusiasm, she suddenly felt reassured. Under the garage's dim yellow light, Eleanor and Caleb began working together. Caleb guided her through each step, inspecting the engine, changing the oil, and cleaning the spark plugs. The cramped space and the smell of grease created an unexpected closeness. Each time Caleb handed her a tool or wiped away grease, their hands brushed briefly. Every touch sent a subtle electric jolt through Eleanor, leaving her flustered. She tried to maintain her composure, but her heart raced every time their eyes accidentally met. The atmosphere in the garage grew inexplicably charged. An invisible tension crept into their movements, into the clinking of tools and the soft sound of their breathing. As Caleb bent down to check under the car, his white t-shirt rode up, revealing the toned curve of his back and strong, defined muscles. Eleanor froze for a moment, her gaze unintentionally lingering. Immediately, she looked away, a warm flush spreading across her cheeks. She scolded herself for stealing a glance, but couldn't deny the magnetic pull of Caleb's masculine presence. It was just a fleeting moment, but it was enough for Eleanor to realize that Caleb was no longer just a young man. In the dim light of the garage, he had the presence of a man, strong, confident, and undeniably alluring. Eleanor leaned against the wall, her hands clenched tightly as if to steady herself. Her eyes drifted toward Caleb, who was engrossed in fixing the car with visible determination. His face reflected focus, and every movement exuded skill and competence. She let out a quiet sigh, trying to suppress the unfamiliar emotions stirring inside her. But Caleb's presence, his closeness, and the strange energy he brought with him made it impossible to ignore. Beneath the shadow of the vintage car, something new and dangerous was quietly taking shape, a feeling Eleanor wasn't sure whether to flee from or embrace. The grand ballroom gleamed under the dazzling light of enormous crystal chandeliers. The smooth melody of jazz music flowed from the stage, blending with the hum of conversations among elegantly dressed guests. The space was magnificent, every detail exuding luxury and perfection, yet it carried an inexplicable sense of detachment. The large doors opened, and Eleanor stepped in. She wore a navy blue evening gown, soft and exquisite, hugging her slender figure. The fabric swayed gently with her every step, radiating a blend of elegance and understated allure. Her hair was neatly styled in a high bun, revealing her graceful neckline. Her makeup was subtle, just enough to accentuate the refined features of a woman shaped by experience. Eleanor didn't truly enjoy events like this. But as Richard's wife, the successful architect, it was her duty. Charity galas were opportunities for him to expand his network, and her presence was indispensable. Richard stood at the center of a group of businessmen, his practiced smile fixed in place. He spoke passionately about his new architectural projects, his hands tracing lines in the air as if sketching out his ideas. In that moment, it was as though Richard had entirely forgotten Eleanor's presence. Richard was always like this, consumed by a world of numbers and blueprints. He didn't realize that right beside him, Eleanor was slowly becoming a shadow, a woman yearning for attention but left misunderstood. Eleanor stood alone in a corner of the room, holding a glass of white wine. Her gaze swept across the room, searching for something yet expecting nothing in particular. Suddenly, her eyes stopped. Caleb. He stood on the opposite side of the room, leaning casually against a pillar, his gaze fixed directly on her. In a simple yet well-fitted suit, Caleb stood out in his own way, youthful, strong, but quietly confident. His eyes didn't just look at Eleanor, they followed her, deeply and unreservedly. Eleanor felt a slight jolt. Her heart raced uncontrollably, a reaction she couldn't suppress. Caleb's gaze stirred something within her, both thrilling and frightening. She quickly turned away, directing her eyes toward the large window, pretending to admire the city's glittering lights outside. Eleanor felt as though an electric current had surged down her spine. It had been so long since she'd felt a gaze like this, one filled with care and admiration, leaving her both flustered and unsettled. Trying to immerse herself in the party, Eleanor joined a group of acquaintances. She smiled, nodded, and answered polite questions, but her mind refused to focus. She could still feel Caleb's gaze on her, like an invisible thread pulling her back toward him. Every time Eleanor accidentally glanced in his direction, their eyes met again. A tiny spark ignited in the air between them, fleeting but undeniable. The jazz music continued to play, but for Eleanor, it all faded into a distant background. All she could hear was the rapid, chaotic beating of her own heart. Eleanor moved toward the window, gazing at her reflection in the glass. Her eyes stared into the void, but her face betrayed a storm of complex emotions, a hint of confusion, a trace of exhilaration, and a shadow of an unnamed fear. Throughout the evening, Eleanor tried to avoid Caleb's eyes, but it was futile. His gaze was like an unrelenting tide, silently yet powerfully breaking through invisible barriers. And each time their eyes met, the fragile boundaries of morality trembled once more. The coastal town lay shrouded in the stillness of night, broken only by the torrential rain pounding on rooftops. Gusts of wind howled through window gaps, blending with the rain to create a somber nocturnal symphony. Eleanor lay on her bed, her gaze fixed on the dark ceiling above. Pale moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting faint streaks of light across her face. She shifted, sighing softly, unable to fall asleep. The rain seemed to tap into the depths of her heart, stirring the chaotic emotions she had tried so hard to suppress. Caleb's image replayed in her mind, his smile, his gaze, and the moments of closeness in the garage. It all unfolded like a slow-motion film, looping endlessly, leaving her both captivated and uneasy. Eleanor closed her eyes, attempting to banish her thoughts. Yet the more she tried, the clearer Caleb's image became, like a faint ember smoldering within her. She was acutely aware of how wrong and forbidden these feelings were. But reason couldn't contain her heart. Guilt and longing battled within her, pulling her into a whirlpool of conflicting thoughts. Unable to bear it any longer, Eleanor sat up and draped a thin robe over her shoulders. She stepped out of her room, her bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floor. In the kitchen, a soft yellow light from a table lamp cast a warm glow, contrasting with the cold rainstorm outside. Caleb sat at the dining table, his back to Eleanor, staring out the window at the downpour. The light illuminated his face, revealing a quiet, contemplative expression. Eleanor froze. Caleb's solitary figure in the rain-drenched night, bathed in that soft golden glow, tugged at her heart. He looked lonely, profoundly so, a reflection of her own inner solitude. It was a loneliness Eleanor knew all too well. She stepped closer, her voice breaking the silence. "Caleb, can't sleep either?" Startled, Caleb turned. A faint, gentle smile appeared on his lips, a smile tinged with sadness. "No, Aunt Eleanor," he replied softly, his voice blending with the sound of the rain. "The rain's too loud." Eleanor didn't respond immediately, but she returned his smile. She moved to make a pot of hot tea, then sat down across from Caleb. The steam rising from the tea added a touch of warmth to the space between them. At first, their conversation was light, remarks about the rain, the howling wind. But soon, their talk deepened. They shared worries about life, unfinished dreams, and truths they had never shared with anyone else. Eleanor sensed a strange harmony in every word Caleb spoke. He listened to her with a sincerity she hadn't felt from Richard in years. His eyes held no judgment, only empathy and understanding. In the soft glow of the rainy night, two lonely souls found solace in each other. A connection, fragile yet intense, dangerous yet irresistibly compelling, began to form. Time slipped away unnoticed as they sat together in silence. Both gazed out the window, where the rain continued its relentless downpour, like a whispered secret of the night. Eleanor sighed quietly, feeling something within her shift irrevocably. Caleb looked at her, his eyes holding something she dared not name. Outside, the rain still poured, blanketing the town in darkness. But between the two of them, a quiet fire had begun to smolder. Morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting its soft glow over the cluttered room. Dirty plates, cups, and utensils lay scattered across the table and sink, remnants of the previous night's party. The kitchen was silent except for the gentle trickle of water from the faucet, soft instrumental music from a small radio on the counter, and the clinking of dishes as Eleanor worked. Dressed in an oversized shirt and simple jeans, Eleanor busied herself cleaning. Her hair was tied in a loose bun, though a few stray strands clung to her slightly weary face. She picked up a stack of dirty plates, sighing as she glanced around the disordered kitchen. Parties always left Eleanor exhausted. Not because of the mess they created, but because of the emptiness they revealed, the shallow laughter, the trivial conversations. She felt like a spectator on the sidelines, disconnected from the world around her. The kitchen door opened, and Caleb stepped in. He wore a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still tousled from sleep. Noticing Eleanor hard at work, he hesitated for a moment. "Let me help you with that," Caleb offered, his tone gentle yet enthusiastic. Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes momentarily surprised. Before she could reply, Caleb had rolled up his sleeves and begun wiping the table, washing glasses, and putting away dishes. Caleb's help brought Eleanor a quiet sense of comfort. It wasn't just the shared workload, it was his genuine thoughtfulness. A subtle warmth spread through her as she watched him. Eleanor carried a stack of delicate porcelain plates to the cabinet. At the same moment, Caleb reached for the top plate. Their hands brushed. A jolt of electricity ran down Eleanor's spine. She flinched slightly, nearly dropping the plates. The soft clink of the contact echoed as their hands touched. Eleanor inhaled sharply, her heart beating faster than usual. Caleb quickly steadied the stack, preventing it from falling. His eyes met hers, filled with concern but also something deeper, a quiet, profound care, and an unspoken emotion Eleanor dared not analyze. For a fleeting moment, time seemed to stand still. In the stillness of the kitchen, only their quickened breaths and racing hearts could be heard. The space between them shrank to the point where Eleanor could feel Caleb's warmth. The line between familial affection and something entirely different had never felt thinner. Eleanor quickly withdrew her hand, her eyes lowering to avoid Caleb's gaze. Her face flushed with heat, her cheeks tinged with red as though caught doing something forbidden. Thank you," she stammered, her voice trembling with nervousness she couldn't hide. She turned away abruptly, placing the plates in the cabinet and focusing on controlling her breathing. She didn't dare look back at Caleb, afraid of what his eyes might reveal. Caleb stood still, his gaze following Eleanor. His expression held a mix of confusion and something else, something indefinable, as if he had unknowingly crossed a line he hadn't seen. The soft music continued to play, the dishes clinked faintly, but the atmosphere in the kitchen had transformed. A peculiar tension, both suffocating and magnetic, now enveloped the two of them. The afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the large glass windows, illuminating the elegant space of the local art gallery. The pristine white walls were adorned with a variety of works, landscapes, still life, and most prominently, a large abstract painting that dominated an entire wall. Classical instrumental music played throughout the room, blending seamlessly with the quiet footsteps of visitors. The atmosphere was both serene and brimming with creative inspiration, as if each person present was searching for something beyond words. Eleanor and Caleb entered, their contrasting demeanors making them stand out. Eleanor wore a cream-colored shift dress, simple yet elegant. Caleb, in a rolled-sleeve shirt and khaki pants, exuded an understated charm. Eleanor had suggested visiting the art gallery, hoping to find some peace and inspiration amidst the turmoil in her mind. Caleb, without hesitation, agreed to join her. He had a particular fondness for art, especially abstract pieces. They stopped in front of the gallery's largest painting. The abstract work was composed of overlapping swaths of red, blue, yellow, and black, evoking a sense of chaos yet undeniable allure. The swirling lines and thick layers of paint seemed to conceal an untold story. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the painting. "What do you think this piece is trying to say?" Caleb remained silent for a moment, his gaze locked on the painting as if searching for its hidden messages. After a thoughtful pause, his voice emerged, calm and reflective. Maybe it's about inner conflict. About the emotions we bury deep inside, the things words can't express. Eleanor nodded, her eyes reflecting a deep understanding. The chaotic brushstrokes of the painting seemed to mirror her own state of mind, tangled, conflicted, yet undeniably genuine. I feel the same, she said softly, her voice carrying a subtle sadness. Sometimes, I feel like I'm trapped in a world where I don't belong. Caleb turned to look at Eleanor, his gaze tender and filled with empathy. You're not alone, Eleanor, he said, his voice both gentle and steady. You'll always have me. That simple statement made Eleanor freeze. Her heart pounded, as though an icy barrier within her had begun to melt. She looked into Caleb's eyes and, for the first time, realized that he wasn't speaking as merely a relative. In his gaze, she saw something deeper, an unmistakable and sincere care. In the quiet stillness of the gallery, Eleanor felt an invisible wall between them crumble. What she found wasn't just understanding, but a profound connection, a harmony of souls she had never experienced before. They continued standing before the abstract painting, yet the distance between them seemed to vanish. Caleb and Eleanor looked at each other, their eyes conveying emotions too complex for words, shyness, authenticity, and a quiet yearning. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a gentle yet radiant glow. In that light, amidst the tranquil atmosphere and the soft strains of music, two souls were beginning to truly find each other. The weekend afternoon sky was a serene blue, dotted with clouds lazily drifting by, mirroring the tranquility of a new day. The national forest stood in its untouched beauty, with towering trees stretching toward the sunlight. Beams of light pierced through the canopy, creating shimmering patterns on the ground, like a living, breathing masterpiece. Eleanor and Caleb walked along a narrow trail, the crunching of dry leaves beneath their feet harmonizing with the chirping of birds and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. Eleanor wore jeans and a khaki jacket, her hair neatly tied back, while Caleb sported a simple t-shirt and long pants. They chatted happily, relaxed smiles lighting up their faces as they soaked in the fresh air gifted by nature. Both sought to escape the chaos of city life. In the quiet of the forest, they hoped to find peace and perhaps a reprieve from their tangled thoughts. Yet, the tranquility was soon disrupted as the sky began to darken. Ominous clouds rolled in, obscuring the sunlight, and the gentle breeze turned into a fierce wind, scattering dry leaves in swirling gusts along the trail. Eleanor and Caleb exchanged uneasy glances as the trail began to vanish into the encroaching darkness and howling winds. Then, without warning, a cold, heavy rain began to pour, forcing them to run in search of shelter. They discovered a small cave at the base of a rocky cliff, its dim interior lit faintly by the fading light outside. The sound of raindrops pelting the ground and the whistling whine through the cracks in the rocks heightened the wilderness's raw and untamed aura. Inside, Eleanor and Caleb sat close together. Their damp clothes clung to their bodies, and the chill made them shiver. Caleb quickly gathered some dry branches from the cave floor and lit a small fire. The flickering flames illuminated their faces, revealing fatigue, worry, and a growing sense of connection. In the confined space, their physical proximity became all the more noticeable. Their eyes met, not merely in comfort but with a depth of emotion that transcended the roles they had once ascribed to each other. Outside, the rain continued its relentless downpour, but inside, the warmth of the fire softened the cold. Caleb gently brushed a wet strand of hair from Eleanor's face. His eyes locked onto hers, deep and unspoken, as though he were trying to convey 1,000 words he couldn't say aloud. Eleanor stood motionless, her eyes meeting Caleb's. In that moment, time seemed to pause. She said nothing, but she could feel the warmth of his breath and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat close to hers. Caleb leaned closer, slowly and deliberately, as if afraid to shatter the fragile tension of the moment. Eleanor didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, letting her emotions guide her. And then, their lips met, tender yet fervent. The kiss was not merely an expression of affection but a release of long-suppressed emotions. Under the flickering firelight and the pounding rain, their hearts intertwined, forgetting everything else around them. Caleb wrapped his arms around Eleanor, pulling her closer. His warmth radiated outward, chasing away the night's chill. Eleanor responded, her hands trembling yet determined as they encircled his neck, holding him even closer. Outside, the rain continued to fall in torrents, but inside the cave, the fire burned not just in the space around them but within their hearts, a fire of love and uncontainable longing. They forgot everything, the rain, the darkness, and the rules of the outside world. All that remained were two people, two souls, and their most honest emotions. In that moment, Eleanor and Caleb knew they had crossed a boundary, discovering something they could no longer deny. A few days after the stormy night in the forest, the atmosphere in the house grew heavy and tense. A close-up of Eleanor's face showed her pale and gaunt, dark circles under her eyes betraying sleepless nights and deep worry. The sound of a clock ticking punctuated the silence of the room. Distant waves crashing on the shore no longer seemed soothing but weighed heavily in the air. After that night in the forest, Eleanor was consumed by unbearable guilt. She knew she had crossed a line and betrayed Richard, the husband she had always loved and respected. The weight of her guilt pressed down on her heart like an unbearable burden. Eleanor sat silently in the corner of the room, her gaze unfocused as she stared into space, her mind adrift in a sea of conflicting memories. Images of Caleb in the cave surfaced in her mind, the firelight casting shadows across his face. She remembered the tenderness in his eyes, the way he looked at her with unspoken love before leaning in for that searing kiss. That kiss had been so intense it felt as though the fire burned not only around them but through the depths of her being. The memory dissolved like smoke, replaced by another. Richard. His smile, bright under the golden sunlight of a past day. Eleanor recalled the way he once looked at her with unwavering affection, a gaze she thought would never fade. Richard, with his patience and warmth, had been her sanctuary. But now, memories of him felt like a fleeting breeze, present but no longer able to touch her deeply. Her final memory was of her own hands, hands trembling under the weight of two loves. Hands that had once held Richard's, promising a future. Hands that had also reached for Caleb's, not to make promises, but to seek something profoundly her own. Reality pulled her back with a heavy sigh. Eleanor knew these memories were not just fragments of the past, but crossroads she must confront. Yet her heart had already begun whispering an answer she was not ready to admit. The rapid beating of her heart and her shallow breaths echoed in her mind. Memories of her kiss with Caleb haunted her, interwoven with images of Richard, the man who had trusted and loved her unconditionally. The conflict between desire and duty, love and morality, tore her apart. Eleanor left her bedroom and walked downstairs. She made an effort to avoid Caleb. Whenever she heard his footsteps, she found something to occupy herself or retreated to another room. The sound of Eleanor's hurried footsteps and soft closing doors filled the house. Whenever she saw Caleb from afar, her heart raced. Guilt pressed heavily on her chest. Her eyes longed to meet his, yet she was equally desperate to avoid him. She asked herself, what have I done? Could things ever return to the way they were? Could she ever look Richard in the eye without feeling guilty? These questions surrounded her, unanswered and relentless. A longer sequence of memories about Richard followed. Scenes of him tenderly caring for Eleanor during an illness, offering her encouragement during professional struggles, and sharing laughter during their vacations played like a film reel. Eleanor closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the flood of memories. She saw herself lying in bed, her face pale with fever. Richard sat beside her, worry etched in his face as he placed a cool cloth on her forehead. He spoke softly, his tone gentle as though not to wake her. Just rest, Eleanor. I'll handle everything else. She could never forget the warmth of his hand in hers, as if he were trying to lend her his strength. The memories shifted to a rainy evening when Eleanor sat in her study, her mind burdened by work struggles. Richard appeared with 2 mugs of tea, setting one in front of her and gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Eleanor, you're stronger than you think. I know you can overcome anything. His words were not empty promises, but genuine belief, a belief that had lifted her when she felt weakest. Another scene played, sunlit beaches, Eleanor laughing as Richard chased her in a playful game. They collapsed onto the sand, exhausted but happy. He turned to her, his smile as radiant as the sun, and said, "I wish every day could be like this." These memories unfolded slowly, leaving Eleanor with a deep ache. Richard, with all his sincerity and warmth, had once been an irreplaceable part of her life. Now, those memories weighed heavily, reminding her of a love she had betrayed, a man who had loved her so deeply. Eleanor opened her eyes, staring into the void before her. Her heart remained torn between past and present, between Richard and Caleb, between what had once been hers and what she now craved. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. She thought of the happy moments with Richard, the moments she had traded for one forbidden kiss. The thought of betraying Richard filled Eleanor with unbearable pain. She felt like a terrible person, unworthy of his love and trust. Eleanor stood by the window, gazing out at the sea. Her face was etched with despair and regret. The waves crashed steadily, a constant reminder of what had transpired. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly suffocating. Since the kiss in the forest, Eleanor and Caleb had nearly avoided each other entirely, yet the tension between them smoldered like an inextinguishable flame. That afternoon, Caleb stepped into the garage, where the vintage Mustang lay still, partially covered by a tarp. The space was quiet, save for the faint whistle of wind seeping through cracks and the occasional clink of metal. Caleb glanced around, his gaze settling on Eleanor. She stood with her back to him, her eyes fixed intently on the car, as if seeking answers from the past. The pale golden light streaming through a small window highlighted her fragile silhouette. Caleb knew he couldn't keep running. The feelings he had been suppressing had become a tidal wave within him, and he had to speak the truth, no matter the potential consequences. He stepped closer to Eleanor, stopping just a short distance away, his heart pounding so hard he could feel its echo in his chest. "Eleanor," Caleb's voice broke the silence, trembling but resolute. Eleanor flinched and turned to face him. Her eyes were a mixture of confusion and worry, but there was also something else, a longing she couldn't bring herself to admit. Caleb took a deep breath, summoning all his courage. "I love you, Eleanor," he confessed, his voice raw and unwavering. "I know it's wrong, I know it's unacceptable. But I can't deny how I feel. I've tried to forget, but I can't. I can't live without you." Caleb's confession struck Eleanor like lightning. Her entire body trembled as though electrified. She took a step back, her wide eyes locked on Caleb, unblinking. Tears began streaming down Eleanor's face. She shook her head, her voice choked with emotion. "Caleb, we can't. This is wrong. It's wrong for everyone." Caleb's gaze didn't waver. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. His eyes burned with determination and an intense love. "Why not?" Caleb asked, his voice pleading. "Why do we have to run from what we feel? Why should we live by rules we don't believe in?" Eleanor looked down at the floor, her shoulders trembling as the storm of emotions within her reached its peak. Because I'm your father's wife, Caleb," she said, her voice breaking. "Because this is wrong. It's impossible." Caleb refused to let her words deter him. Gently, he reached out and pulled Eleanor into his arms. For a moment, Eleanor stiffened, trying to push him away. But then, she couldn't resist the warmth and comfort of his embrace. She allowed herself to rest against Caleb's chest, her tears flowing freely. "I know it's hard," Caleb whispered, his voice low and steady. "But I don't care what anyone else thinks. I don't care about the rules. I only care about you, Eleanor. Only you." Eleanor sobbed uncontrollably, her conflicted emotions spilling out, guilt, pain, and the love she dared not acknowledge. Caleb's arms felt like the only anchor in the storm raging within her, offering both solace and an irresistible, dangerous invitation. Outside, the wind howled louder, but inside the garage, time seemed to stand still. The two of them, consumed by emotions that transcended every boundary, stood there, letting their forbidden love lead the way. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, like a brewing storm on the verge of erupting. A few days after Caleb's confession, Richard began to notice the subtle changes in Eleanor's and Caleb's behavior, the furtive glances, the awkward gestures, and the unusual silences between them. In his study, Richard sat in a large armchair, his eyes fixed on a family photograph on the desk. Soft, melancholic instrumental music played from an old radio, blending with the sound of pencil strokes on paper, until the movement suddenly stopped. Richard, a perceptive and experienced man, couldn't ignore the signs. He sensed something was amiss, a secret being kept, and the weight of it bore heavily on him. Richard stood, his stern gaze sweeping the room. He exhaled deeply, then stepped out of the study, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. "Caleb!" Richard's voice rang out, cold and commanding, piercing the silence of the house. Caleb appeared in the hallway, his face etched with worry. He walked into the study, standing before Richard, but unable to meet his father's eyes. Richard stood tall, his sharp eyes fixed on Caleb. Without preamble, his voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I want to talk to you about Eleanor." Caleb flinched, but quickly lowered his head, silent. He had known this moment would come eventually, but hadn't expected it so soon. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze unwavering. "I've noticed what's been going on between you two," Richard said, his voice low and cold, carrying a terrifying weight. "I don't need the details, and I don't want excuses. All I want is one thing from you, Caleb, end this. Now." Caleb lifted his head, his eyes now filled with pain and resolve. He took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage to say what he had been suppressing for so long. "Dad," Caleb began, his voice breaking but steadfast, "I love Eleanor." The words struck Richard like a dagger to the heart. His eyes widened in disbelief as if the very foundation of his world had been shattered. Caleb's declaration echoed in his mind like thunder, obliterating everything he had believed about his family. A close-up of Richard's face revealed the raw emotions etched into his features, pain, betrayal, and rage. His hands clenched into fists, but his voice grew quieter, colder. "Caleb, do you even know what you're saying?" Caleb nodded, his eyes locked on his father's, despite the anguish in his gaze. "I know, Dad," Caleb replied, his voice trembling. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop loving her. I've tried, but I can't." Richard stepped back as if physically struck by Caleb's words. He turned away, struggling to regain his composure. His heavy breathing filled the quiet room, like the prelude to an impending storm. In that moment, Richard realized the family he had built was teetering on the brink of collapse. And standing before him, his son, was the one who had lit the match. Richard turned back, his eyes filled with both sorrow and fury. He said nothing more, only stared at Caleb with an expression of unmasked disappointment. Caleb stood motionless, his hands limp at his sides, acutely aware of the weight of the consequences his confession had unleashed. In the suffocating silence, every boundary, every rule, every shred of trust had been broken. In the days following the confrontation, Eleanor lived in a state of unrelenting tension, every passing moment a form of torment. She tried to find solace in mundane tasks, but even cleaning the house couldn't distract her from the guilt and dread that gnawed at her. Eleanor wiped the surface of a table, her movements mechanical, her gaze unfocused as it drifted into an empty void. The shrill ring of the telephone shattered the oppressive quiet. Eleanor jumped, the cloth slipping from her hands to the floor. She picked up the receiver, and Bethany's sharp voice rang out on the other end. "Eleanor," Bethany said, her tone cutting, "I saw you and Caleb in the forest. I saw everything. If you don't confess to Richard, I will." The phone nearly slipped from Eleanor's grasp. Her entire body trembled, her eyes widening in horror. Cold sweat beaded on her forehead, and her face turned ashen. The truth was out. Eleanor knew she couldn't hide any longer. She had to face Richard and confront the inevitable consequences of her actions. Late that evening, in the dimly lit living room, the pale yellow glow of a table lamp cast a somber shadow over the space. Eleanor and Richard sat opposite each other in two armchairs, the distance between them like an unbridgeable chasm separating two people who had once called each other husband and wife. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. She began to speak, her voice trembling with fear and remorse. "Richard, I have something to tell you." Richard lifted his head, his expression stern yet devoid of visible emotion. To Eleanor, it felt like staring at an impenetrable wall. Lowering her gaze, Eleanor forced the words out, each one cutting into her like a blade. She confessed everything, the closeness that had developed between her and Caleb, the moments when reason was overpowered by emotion. Her voice grew quieter with every word, until tears began streaming down her face. "I know it was wrong, unforgivable. I'm so sorry, Richard. I truly am." When Eleanor finally looked up, Richard's face was pale. His eyes reflected not only disappointment but the utter collapse of trust. He rose from his seat, not saying a word, not uttering a single accusation. Richard left the room, the door closing behind him with a resounding thud, like the final punctuation to an irrevocable end. Eleanor curled up on the sofa, burying her face in her hands. Her sobs echoed in the oppressive silence of the room. Tears streamed down her exhausted, grief-stricken face. In that moment, Eleanor felt as though everything around her had crumbled. Consumed by despair and guilt, she realized that her actions had destroyed everything she once cherished. The days following the confession passed in a tense and suffocating silence. Richard avoided both Eleanor and Caleb. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, was now steeped in gloom and quiet. That morning, rain drizzled steadily, each drop hitting the porch with a melancholic rhythm. Caleb stood at the door, holding an old suitcase in his hand. His eyes met Eleanor's through the doorway, filled with a mixture of anguish and love. Eleanor stood inside, her eyes red and swollen, tears streaming down her face. She knew this was the right thing to do, but it didn't lessen the ache in her heart. Caleb took a deep breath and stepped closer to Eleanor. Without a word, they embraced tightly. Their tears mingled, a silent exchange of emotions only they could understand. Caleb released her and took a step back. He looked at Eleanor one last time, his gaze carrying an ocean of love and regret. Then, he turned and walked away, his figure gradually fading into the rain. It was a moment of parting, a painful but necessary decision to set everyone free. After Caleb's departure, Eleanor knew she couldn't let everything fall apart any further. With renewed resolve, she sought to repair her relationship with Richard. One evening, under the gentle glow of a table lamp in the living room, Eleanor sat across from Richard. Her face showed signs of weariness, but her eyes were steadfast. "Richard," she began, her voice trembling with both sorrow and sincerity, "I'm sorry. I know I've hurt you and destroyed what we had. But I truly regret it. I love you, and I want to fix this. I promise to change if you can give me another chance." Richard sat in silence, his eyes locked on Eleanor's. In her gaze, he saw not only remorse but also determination and honesty. Though his heart still ached, his love for her had never fully disappeared. After a long pause, Richard nodded slowly. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low but warm, "I've made mistakes too. If we work together, I believe we can make things better. I'll give us, another chance." As time passed, Eleanor and Richard began to learn how to forgive each other. A montage of brief scenes showed them rebuilding their bond, walking along the beach, sharing candlelit dinners, and chatting on the familiar living room sofa. Each moment was imperfect, but step by step, they rebuilt the trust they had lost. They realized that love isn't about being flawless, it's about facing challenges together and choosing to stay. One afternoon, Eleanor and Richard sat side by side on the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore. Their hands were clasped together, and their gazes were filled with tenderness. The future remains uncertain. Old wounds may heal, but can they truly find happiness after everything that has happened? Only time will tell. But what matters most is that they chose to give each other a chance to love, to forgive, and to start anew. The sound of waves lapping against the shore filled the air as the sun set, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and gold. The scene closed with a faint glimmer of hope, enough to stir the hearts of those watching.